We're almost there, right? Why don't everyone just close their eyes and take a deep breath and just kind of recenter. We've been through a lot this morning and we're not done, but I think it's really important. It's like a guided meditation. I think it's really important that we still stay tuned in and try to absorb everything and be with it and contemplate it. So one more deep breath. Oh, that felt good. Okay, everybody here? I was gonna make you guys all stand and do jumping jacks, but I didn't think that was appropriate. Okay. So, yes, my name is Chef Alex Askew. My bio is in there, and I will sum up my 40-year career. You wanna get that? Oh, I would sum up my 40-year career. I started cooking when I was 14, so that explains why I'm not all gray. But you know, I did everything but cruise ships, including a 6-year stint in healthcare as a regional executive chef. So I understand the language, the bob and weave of the food system in healthcare, patient services, retail, and I have a very intimate knowledge of how food flows through systems. And so that's the 30-second overview of my experience. What we're gonna do is really do a dive on African-American food cultural heritage. I've heard it mentioned before about cultural competency. Now there's this new word or phrase, cultural humility and cultural sensitivity. I would all say that lends to we need to be more in tune about the different cultures of the communities that we are trying to serve. I would say that would be a good way of explaining it. So yeah, we're gonna take a dive into African-American cuisine, which for those that need any clarity, happened on this side of the pond, right? So that's kind of where it happened. And what I like to do is just kind of establish some framework, right? I heard mentioned before about establishing a safe space, right? I think there needs to be more safe spaces for conversation, you know, where people realize that there's some sensitive topics, not so comfortable, but unless we have these conversations, they will not get more comfortable, right? So a safe space is where, you know, it's where people feel safe. You know, there's open-minded conversation, and when there is a sensitive, a super sensitive topic that comes about, you know, the rest of the people in that space make that person who does not feel safe. That's how it's supposed to work. We're not supposed to leave someone in the corner crying, or we want to be able to talk to them. So everyone has to put on their psychologist hat from time to time. So we also want to practice stretching, right? We want to kind of talk about the hows and whys. And again, ask those questions that, well, you might not feel that are appropriate, but they are appropriate in a safe space if we are going to try to understand it and get to that level where we can develop empathy. Everybody with me so far? All right. So we're going to talk about some history, because you can't not talk about African-American food heritage without talking about history. We're going to talk about some of the challenges, because there's some challenges now. We can't, as someone of color and African-American descent, I can't eat like my grandfather did. And we're going to go through some of that. And then talk about some of the approaches. One of them is establishing a safe space despite of color, and really getting on the same page in terms of having deep personal dialogue, you know? And I think that's really, really where a lot of our focus needs to be, especially if we're in the care space and wellness space. So this is the Cliff Note version. This is what happened. And, you know, I did, some years ago, I did my ancestry DNA, and I was all like excited that I thought I was Native American, and I had all these tribes, and it was just an arrow from like Welsh Europe and Congo and right to North Carolina, and the town's name is Askewville, and I was like open and shut case. But for some, it's a little bit more complicated, right? Because you also have the fact that there's the Caribbean, Puerto Rico, and eastern side of South America that were really impacted by the slave trade as well. So, you know, through this slave trade, there were some rich traditions, cooking methods, and we explored that in that workshop this morning. What a fun workshop that was, right? And, you know, we have to understand that these cooking methods, these connections are based on cultural customs. This is less about race than it is about culture. And if we're going to be culturally insensitive, then you might not hear it, but people will feel it, and there will be a lack of that connection. And again, the question is, how can we be in that wellness space and be really effective? So yeah, at the top of the society, there were the plantation owners, right? Everyone's, I imagine, has seen a version of Roots, not so far off from the truth. And you had influences not only from where the slaves came from, but also their European slave masters, right? And you know, the bottom, you know, of that framework were the slaves and the Native Americans. You know, there was a lot to be said about the Native Americans and the slaves that came over, and the mixture of these food cultural ingredients as well. And we'll touch on that a little bit. But at the end of the day, I think what's really important to remember here is, and this is where creativity, born out of the power of necessity. They were given food items that ordinarily would have been thrown out. They had to figure out how to make something that nobody wanted. And you doing something wrong?
Swap.
Oh, you want to swap? Okay.
I'm sorry. There's some interference on that one. Sorry about that. There you go.
They had to figure out what to do with these ingredients, and not necessarily making healthy. I mean, that was not on their mind. It was to make them palatable enough to eat, right? And not only eat as an adult, but eat for the children, you know? And so that took some ingenuity. And really, I would label that as survival conditions. But they were able to figure it out, or I wouldn't even be here today. So this is the horror, you know. I would say that, you know, it's very hard to ignore what happened. When I meet people, and I have met people that try to convince me that I should forget about slavery, you can imagine the expression on my face, or, you know, why don't you pretend it didn't exist? I'm like, you know, I thought you were smart. Like, you know, that's not so much of a smart thing to say. And, you know, it's a pain, it's a trauma, it's from the past, but there are pieces of that in terms of food culture that are amazingly important for people of the descent, including myself, and I'll tell you a story a little bit later, of connecting to that joyous pain, you know, through and that's really what the cornerstones of civilizations are built on: food, music, and art, right? And so this, you know, and the music absolutely came with all of their convenings and gatherings, but it was the food that was centric. It was the food that was centric, and that food connected them to their ancestors. And even today, there's food that connects me to my father, which connected him to his father, and it really kind of makes me emotional. So there were rations. There wasn't a lot of food. I mean, a lot of it was a small piece of meat, and that was your flavoring. When I talk about plant forward, this was plant forward times 10, right? It was mostly a lot of vegetables, and the meat was, really depending on what it was. If it was anything of value, it was used as a flavoring agent. And then we had everything else that ordinarily would get thrown out, which is on some of today's five-star menus, right? Who would think? Who would think that 100 years ago that these would be on these Michelin star restaurants? But everything was rationed. I still remember my dad telling me stories about when he was growing up in the deep South in North Carolina, and they measured everything by the month. They're like, we have a month of beans, and we had a month of this, and I have a month of that, and oh my God, if we ran out of beans, we look at Papa, and I'm like, woof, man, this sounds traumatizing. But that was his life. That was my father's life. So you can imagine what his father's life was. This is something that is really testament to what I just mentioned, from a slave book of context. And it was a lot of soups, it was a lot of porridges, it was a lot of stews. You did things, you simmered them all day, especially some of the meats that were tough as nails. You had to simmer them overnight. I mean, this was that braising method was on the top of the spot, because if you braise something successfully, you can pretty much braise anything. And but you had that one piece of meat that kind of was stretched out, you know what I mean? And everyone got a little bit of taste of it, but meat was not centric. So there was all of these influences. One of the things that was obvious, and the slave traders knew this, is that if there weren't ingredients that the slaves were familiar with, they were not going to eat. And if they didn't eat, then they would get sick and die. So they realized it was very, very important on these slave ships to have some ingredients that they were familiar with. So there was that feeling also of being attached to home, right? And that really is kind of the basis of a lot of African American cuisine that especially started out as soul food. It was these ingredients that, the black eyed peas made into Hoppin' John, right? That a lot of families eat on New Year's Eve for New Year's Day. Is New Year's Eve? New Year's Day. New Year's Day for luck. I think we ate it both days for extra luck. And it really just, that became like the staple beginning of the heritage of African American food culture. Got really kind of fused together because you have like Creole cooking. I mean, that is like really deep to I worked with a chef who worked for Paul Prudhomme, and I mean, he couldn't stop talking about food. It was so soulful, and there were a lot of these different influences. Again, the Native American and how they did things, and really kind of teaching the slaves what to do with these ingredients that were native to America. So there was kind of like some covert cooking classes going on, right? And again, this morning, true testament, the spices. If you know how to flavor food with spices. Besides the point, there's another presentation on the medicinal properties of some of these spices, because that was part of their, it was food and medicine, right? Together. And, making these amalgamations of different flavors. And again, New Orleans is a perfect example of that, because they have, that is like a melting pot. It is, really, really good between all of the different bases. A lot of it not so good for you, but I mean, you will feel good after you just eat it. Maybe the next day you'll suffer a little bit, but that's part of that feeling type of good, food, and it comes from that fusion of those different heritage. But a main core component were the slaves. So, this cooking, this style of creating different cooking methods, you can argue that it was a basis of what I would say what was transformed into not only soul food, but also the presence of having chefs in the kitchen that were Black and of the descent, because they were so involved and intimate with food and being in the kitchen, because that was so centric. It really created the baseline of having some of the best chefs. I mean, everyone knows about Thomas and Jefferson, slave chef, and I mean, but there were a lot more stories of that told, because once you know how to cook, you can really develop that skill into almost a culinary proficiency. And so there's a lot to be, although a lot of this is joyful pain, there's a lot to be proud of here, of what was created through this painful process. So again, dear friend of mine who passed away, Leah Chase, New Orleans, I because of the organization that I co-founded, BCA Global, I had the chance to meet a lot of prominent chefs that were influencers in my day, between Edna Lewis and Patrick Clark. And the conversations that we had were very, very rich about how they felt they were influenced by their heritage. And it was unspoken publicly, but privately, we had these conversations, understanding that the Pullman Porters were you couldn't get, if there was a 6-star, you'd give them 6 stars. Service, food, 100%. For those that don't know about the Pullman Porters, I really encourage you to do a little bit of research, because that was a whole part of history. And from a social economic perspective, they were one of the first Black groups to be able to send their kids to college because of that work ethic, because of the connection to food. So really, really powerful stuff. And as you start to analyze the history, and yes, there are some horrors here, but there's what was born out of it is really amazing. And I think that these are the stories that need to be told, the ones that are underneath the layers here, that really give some context to, why there needs to be a sense of pride in the African-American community, especially regarding food cultural heritage. So then there was this migration, right? You had the Emancipation Proclamation, and then you had, big groups from the South, becoming, what do they call it? City slickers, right? I know my dad came up from deep rural South. They didn't have no lights in the street. It was crazy. And, he was in Brooklyn. He was in the city, and you could see him all sharp. And for some reason, everybody owned an iron. all their clothes were pressed. And, they were proud, of getting it to the big city and all the action and all the movement. And they wanted to have some semblance of home too. And that was all, whether it was the Midwest migration, and all of this stuff is well documented about these different migration routes. Someone was asking me, like, do you know Askew's in Detroit? And I said, Askew's all everywhere, but there's an Askewville in North Carolina. And, it's a really amazing what happened with the different influences, because on top of that, depending on what region, whether it was the Northeast, whether it was the Southwest, whether it was the Midwest, Chicago, Detroit, you had little tweaks in this cuisine that was going to be created. And it's really magical to actually watch that evolution and learn about that evolution. So some key factors, just to kind of do a brief overview, because this is like a segment that we're kind of rolling up. A lot of slaves mix. The Black Indians was almost a group of slaves and Indians that actually even lived together and shared food cultural practices. What people don't realize is that over 90% of the slaves went to the Latin Americas. Over 90% of the slaves went to Latin America. So big influence there. Again, to a doctor's presentation, Caribbean, Cuba, Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico was the Taino Indians, and they also had slaves, sugarcane plantations, and the like. How many people have visited Charleston? Yeah. So amazing, amazing history around rice. I did not know this until I actually spent some time there. But, the slaves brought to Charleston had to be almost engineers and able to understand how to flood the rice fields and drain the rice fields. In fact, I looked at some of the records. I mean, they basically self-managed. If you did your work on if you did Wednesday's work on Tuesday, you were off on Wednesday. I was just like, I didn't even know this kind of slavery existed. I wouldn't label it as good slavery though. But to understand, and Carolina Gold, I mean, the rice trade, before it moved to, from the Carolinas to Texas and then China, but, Carolina Gold was a main key stock. And it was really amazing how that whole area kind of just like flourished, almost like a gold rush, but it was a rice rush. And it's something to be studied, to look at what the influence of that was, because it was all built on slavery. All right, so now let's talk about this soul food. Who knows what soul food is? Don't just have the two tinted people raise their hands. Come on. All right, so soul food is basically, I mean, the phrase is really built upon having food connect to your soul and remembering that memorance. And no matter, I mean, it was part of the celebratory things that happened in the different cities after the migration. None of it was good for your health, but it helped feed your soul, right? And so that really was kind of like the birth of it, because they us African Americans wanted to have something to call their own in terms of a food and a food culture, and there it was, soul food. So these are some pictures that represent what some of the training looked like. Again, excellence in hospitality, excellence on the culinary food side, but from the African American perspective, it was soul food. That's what we knew. And all of these are staples as part of it. The okra, obviously, that is everywhere in African American food heritage. The black-eyed peas, and also, the sweet potatoes, which is really, in Africa was yams, but over here, sweet potatoes, which is slightly different, but still you could look at it and eat it and kind of get some semblance of remembering that. And when I start to talk about, and I'm doing community work, just trying to get people to understand what transpired in 2 generations. And it's very, very simple. My father burnt twice as many calories as I did, and that's because he was up at 5, going at work at 6:30 and worked for 12 hours as a Pepsi Cola. He owned a Pepsi Cola route, and it was real man's work. His father worked in the fields, and that was 12, 14 hours, and he walked everywhere. He drove less. So once you start understanding that, if you're burning whatever it is, 15, as an African American, someone of color, 1,500, 2,000 calories, You have to, with a little bit of explanation that I've tried this and it's worked, that you explain we have to do things differently because our bodies are not going to be able to perform or resist chronic disease that readily if we are not burning the calories, that are necessary. And despite that, if you look at what was burnt in previous generations, it was almost like there wasn't this huge factor of obesity. There wasn't, because calories were burnt. I mean, you were running through the course of the day, and it was maybe not 4 or 5 days a week, maybe it was 7 days a week. So when I explain this to people about why we have to change our diets, it becomes a different argument, a different debate, because then they really don't seem like I'm taking something away or I'm trying to propose taking something away. It's the fact that, we just don't have the same, calorie, energy expenditures that our ancestors did. And I've seen it happen over, now I get it. I thought it was just, but they have to understand a little bit of the science about why it is what it is, and that might be an angle or a strategy to look at. So going back to the soul food piece of it, it's, again, foods, comfort foods, a lot of fat, a lot of salt, a lot of everything that's really not good for you, but it gives you a memory of family heritage. And I'll share a story to put this in context. So my father passed away 7 years ago. It was a very strange week. My son was born on a Monday. They met in the hospital, and for some uncanny reason, he died the next day in his sleep. But we loved each other. He was like my best friend. And we connected through food a lot of the times. I mean, you could argue that maybe that's why I wanted to become a chef or kept on cooking. But I remember every Sunday morning waking up to this really nutty, toasty smell of my father toasting flour in a cast iron skillet with a fork to make his gravy for the biscuits. And very methodical, no black specks. Very low flame, hemming along. I don't know what he was hemming, but it was hemming along. And I could look at him and I could tell he was thinking about his dad, as this flour, and it takes a very long time to do it that way. The gravies come out really good. But as he's just mixing, and I said, well, why do you do this? Well, my dad taught me how to do it. And I could honestly tell he was having like a moment. So, all right, okay. Didn't fully understand that whole premise of that joyful pain and that connection. Years later, I'm doing a catering event and I'm sauteing chicken. And I flour a couple of pieces and dust it off, throw it in the pan, and some of that flour lands on the stove and it starts to toast. And I'm with a crew of maybe 12, 13, 14 chefs. I start crying profusely. I couldn't stop myself from crying. People said, oh, he's cracked. But that smell, as soon as I got a whiff of it, I just, I might have been saying, Daddy, or I don't know what I was, but it was that strong of a presence. Why do I use this personal story? It's because, it's all of these things of your senses that connect, especially with food. And for African Americans, those memories are so precious. To not be sensitive about those memories, to not want to discuss them with your patients or the people in the community is insensitive. Because those memories are part of our DNA. They make us who we are. And we have to remember. We have to remember. And I'm glad because I miss my father. So I was glad that I was embarrassed. And once I told the story, everyone was just like, oh man, okay, wow, that's far out, okay. But, you know, these are the type of things that we need to start contemplating as we look at doing community work, because these things are not spoken. And unless we have a rapport with the community, they're not gonna tell us these stories. They're not gonna be interested. They're not gonna trust us, but they're so important to doing the work. Oh, all the things bad for you. Oh man, glazed smoked ham, fried pork chops, fried cabbage and bacon. Why'd you have to fry the cabbage? Coleslaw, barbecue beef short ribs, mustard greens and ham hocks. I mean, I remember the day I moved my dad from a ham hock and his collard greens to smoked turkey, and you would think that I moved a mountain. And he was just like, man, I could do this. And I was like, holy smokes. But, you know, didn't want to introduce, hey, you can't cook collard greens with any smoked meat. That would have been like offensive to my own father. But, you know, barbecued pig's feet. You know, but all of these things are really represent, well, to me, I don't do the chitlins thing, but, you know, really the backbone of this cultural heritage that is really reminds, is really a memory of family and ancestral family. And a great conversation started. Well, I remember when I used to be able to eat that. So there was about, I would say 20, 25 years ago, there was a movement that was seen by some of the leading influential Black chefs about the health of eating this for a longer, you know, for a continued long period of time. And the alarm was not effective, no one, but there was definitely statements made and about how we need to start pumping the brakes, you know? And I remember when this happened, I don't even think I was listening either, you know? But there, you know, everyone that made these statements were, you know, influential Black chefs in America. And they wanted to weigh in and let people know that it wasn't like it was when they grew up. And eating this stuff every day was not a good idea. And so they started trying to get people's attention, and it's very well documented, but it did not work. And but now is a really great time to do a restart. And they were talking about the disease because it was happening, it started to happen with people that they knew. It started happening to people that they knew. And these are quality of life issues when someone that you love gets sick, and you have to see them when they're sick versus healthy. That's a totally different experience. And, you know, I think that there's something to be learned about using this as a building block for us to do continued work. And I do, because I'm like, well, it's not just I'm saying it, but this, you know, this was being told 20 years ago, just nobody listened. And so I think there's some context to how we can do a restart around educating nutritional wellness education for communities of color, to let them understand, okay, this was then, now, this was then, this is now, and have them understand that, you know, it's not an effort to take anything away, but to add to a quality of life. And for those individuals that know someone or know a loved one that is fell into that chronic disease scenario, it's very painful to watch. It's very painful to watch. A lot of times, what I'll say to myself is, you know, maybe I should have did something 5 years ago. You know, maybe I should have been part of an intervention of some sort. Yeah, it was an attitude that Well, I'll put it to you this way. It's one thing to try to be healthy. But when you're serious about it, usually it's triggered by a chronic disease situation, and you have to go into a management situation. But it's so important that we have a full court press on this, that young people are educated, adults are educated, aging well seniors. We hit the community at all levels from a systems thinking perspective, and so everyone starts to drive behavioral change. That's what's going to make a significant difference in changing, especially the BIPOC communities of color that are really suffering the most. Every statistic and data I see, it's just, Black and brown people are in trouble, and without well people, there's no social economic viability. So, wealth is definitely connected to health. There's no argument there. So here are some of my solutions. Everyone's talking about how do we move from talking about the problem into actionable solutions. That sense of empathy has to be based on being authentic. I've been in some circles, and clearly the conversations are not authentic. Even an animal can sense when a human's not acting authentic. So I'd really press everyone to contemplate what their level of that is, and how to improve it. Because without that connection, without that bond, we're not going to be able to influence behaviors. It's just not going to happen. If it does, it'll be very, very rare that it happens. The cultural traditions, there's some research that has to be done, and this is not all about just Googling a word, understanding the historical context of something, being able to talk about it, funny story, all right? Let's get off this serious train for a second. When I first started, and I think at the sous chef level, I was interviewing with this white chef who actually worked for Paul Prudhomme. And he really, really wanted me. And he was trying to impress me. And he was like, I know everything about the blues. I'm so connected. And I knew nothing about the blues. And he was just rattling off blues stars. And I'm like, nope, don't know them. No. And, then he started out with, talking about his love of Southern food. And, I really wasn't proficient in New Orleans Creole Cajun. So I was just like, nope, done nothing there. And then he's like, well, I got something to tell you. I said, oh, okay. He says, I always wanted to know what it was like to be a slave. I said, ooh, this is interesting. Tell me more. I said, well, why? First of all, what? And he said, well, I thought that if I could connect to a little bit of that pain, I would be closer to the food. And I said, okay, strange, continue. What else you got? He's like, so I went out to Avery Island and picked hot Tabasco peppers for 2 summers in the blazing sun. And I was just like, oh, man, he's crazy. I want to work for you. But I admire his dedication to trying to get a level of understanding that even I wouldn't do. And for some strange reason, he loved food to a level I have not ever seen before. And I say all that to say, and it's not to be expected to, but that's an example of someone really trying. If he got there, I really don't know. I still don't think he actually was able to, but he was able to glean something from that. And even if it was in his heart, that he said, I made every attempt to go over, to try to understand something that I didn't understand. That's the key message there of that story. And it's one of the strangest stories that I've experienced working for someone. And I love to work with him because he really in his mind thought, oh man, I'm more connected to Black people. That's what he thought, and I rode with him. And it was really, really an interesting experience. And I learned a lot about doing things from a culinary perspective, the right way, honoring the ingredients. And, from everything from, crawfish under the sink. And I'm like, what's scratching the sink? Those are mud bugs and, all these different stories. But he was deeply connected, and he went to the extreme. And I felt, man, if he's willing to do this, I want to work for this guy, even though I know he's crazy. So let's talk about this other solution that I came up with. In 2016, I was a Kellogg Foundation Fellow in Racial Equity and Healing, and in 3 years, we toured 22 cities. And I realized, I was the only chef in the whole national cohorts of fellows. So every conversation around food or food system, wherever city it came my way, it was great. I was like a vortex. It was like amazing. And I realized something incredibly profound. The food system was broken and a lot worse than I thought it was after really studying this and really doing a tour. I realized that. I also realized the work that BCA was doing around culinary diversity needed to be more applied to doing community work, all right? I knew that. I had a systems thinking coach, I had a mindfulness coach, I had a 5 elements coach, which is 5,000-year-old Eastern philosophy. It's really interesting. But I realized that a systems thinking approach needed to be applied to our work. So I came up with this idea of, mindful eating, but every space that I went into the mindfulness or mindful eating space didn't have anybody that looked like me. And I was just like, this doesn't feel so mindful. I mean, my people need this kind of work. Talking about stress reduction, need it. Dealing with trauma, need it. Being more centered, need it. So, I really looked at how could I develop a program that was comprehensive around these principles, and because I do a lot of racial equity work, involved racial equity work, and so Martin Luther King Jr.'s beloved community was really a good piece to latch on. And we wanted to take a comprehensive approach to food insecurity, hunger, social and environmental determinants of health, sustainability, climate change, which I'm sure one day we're going to talk about it, but impacts Black or brown people the most, And so all of these things, wrapped up into what would be a really comprehensive wellness program, right? And looking at how we could rebrand certain pieces that really don't work. Healthy eating does not work in communities of color. We rebranded it, food that tastes good and makes you feel good. People are like, oh, I'll buy that. Won't buy healthy food, same thing, Mental health, we rebranded that as mind-body empowerment. You say mental health in a community of color, you'll see people scattering. But how do we connect the mind to the body in terms of being, that's something. So we also want to consider, and this is just an idea I'm throwing out, how we can rebrand strategies that are not so effective. We know they don't work. The research shows they don't work. They spent over $1 million rebranding recycle into upcycle because they know nobody was going to eat recycled food. And this is and the upcycling movement is raging right now. It's raging. So something to think about that piece of it. We also wanted to involve more culinary professionals of color doing community work. There's no better feeling I get than doing work deep in the community, deep in the hood, and I see someone look at me in a chef's jacket, and it's like dignity is something that we have to have on the table. When you take dignity off the table, a community is devastated. We know that time and time again. So we wanted to, and that's going to be a challenge for us. As we scale this program, we're going to have to train more culinary professionals, chefs of color, to be involved in this work. It's not as glamorous as being on food TV, but, we can work it out. So it's a program where they can get paid to do community work and feel good about it, and really change that persona of doing culinary wellness community work. And we can do it, and we're doing it already. We just, last month, came off a 2-year grant with the NLM and NIH to do the same work in the Virgin Islands. And it was what they say, it was the most successful program they've ever had. That area alone, US Virgin Islands, Puerto Rico included, has a different type of problem, and as that in Puerto Rico they import, I think the latest number is 86% of their food, and in the Virgin Islands, 98% of their food is imported. So there's some very, very complex problems there, besides the fact that there's post-colonialization trauma and a lot of other things. So it all boils down to, how do we bring this whole health equity piece of it with dignity, communicate it with cultural sensitivity, and meeting people where they are first before we go beyond the familiar. Those are like 3 questions in a row. I want you to contemplate that. I'm not expecting an answer. And I didn't think about putting videos in my presentation, but we have some really crushing, short videos of this work that we've done in community. So just make sure you get in touch with me, and I'll make sure the office sends you a link. But it's an opportunity to tack this on to existing programs, because we do look at the different segments of the community. Again, right now, aging well senior population, huge, devastated by COVID, almost like the invisible group that we have to, get in, and because they're not invisible, not in my mind. And the young people, huge opportunity to offset. A young person has a better chance of, a young healthy person has a better chance of, you clapping, of growing into a healthy adult. It starts there. I'll tell you some more stories about my son at dinner, but he's 7 now, and last year when he was 6, he got up and wanted to be a vegetarian and just wanted to, do all these things that improved his quality of life. And I said, hey, I'll support you. I said, I think that's kind of odd at that age, but so yeah. There you go, Dean Carl. We know that this could be another asset, having culinary professionals kind of join your movement, right? Because I think we could work together. We're not working together like we should now, but I think this is a start, me being on the stage right here and right now. And this is a group from Johnson & Wales. So we're America's first and questionably the only organization that connects culinary diversity to food, race, and social justice. So we had literally almost 20 chapters. Johnson & Wales was one of them. Our CIA, Cordon Bleu, and it was really amazing, but it was all about excellence. It was all about the standard. And we didn't accept anything subpar. So maybe, as a group that understands standards, this might be, very compatible. And for me as the leader, I don't really take a lot of slack. These are the same kind of disciplines on the culinary professional side that can be easily adaptable for community wellness. Easily adaptable. Because we're talking about people that are already serious about it. They've been in the game. And if anyone has been in the kitchen for a hot kitchen in July for 12 or 14 hours, you gotta be committed, or you're crazy enough to do it. But the fact of the matter is that is a level of commitment that is compatible with doing some really good community work. And, just look at the joy of the faces after me beating them up for excellence. This is amazing that, you have that kind of response. You have that kind of response of people really being so proud, and that pride is a critical ingredient to the recipe that we're talking about at this conference. And again, look how clean those uniforms are. You know, I mean, it's just, you know, this is what you call a standard that is on the highest level, and that's why I'm very proud that I co-founded this group. Thank you.